Great. Well, welcome everyone to the 40th Annual Harney County Migratory Bird Festival. Really glad to have you all here with us. This presentation this hour is the Natural History and Conservation of Golden Eagles and Other Birds of Prey with Jon Nelson, who is the Curator of Wildlife at the High Desert Museum. The 40th Annual Harney County Migratory Bird Festival is made possible by all of these federal agencies, nonprofits, community businesses, and community members. We're really proud of the energy and enthusiasm that comes from this group to make this event possible every year, and particularly this year as we've gone virtual. So thank you all for joining us, and just want to recognize those partners. So who am I? I'm Janelle Wicks. I'm the Executive Director of the Friends of Malheur National Wildlife Refuge, and as a partner on the planning committee for the Bird Festival, really exciting to welcome you all here today. So what you can expect, approximately 40-minute long presentation with time for a question and answer. I'm going to ask that you remain muted throughout and feel free to type questions in the chat box. I will be keeping my eye on them during the presentation and will answer questions at the end. Thank you so much. So, the natural history and conservation of golden eagles and other birds of prey. Jon Nelson serves as the Curator of Wildlife at the High Desert Museum, situated in Bend, Oregon, where he has worked for the past 7+ years. Jon cares for a diverse collection of wildlife, including fish, reptiles, amphibians, birds, and mammals, but has a soft spot for birds of prey. Today, Jon is bringing us to the museum to meet and learn about golden eagles and other birds of prey that we may see in the high desert of Eastern Oregon. Please remain muted for the duration of the presentation. Again, write your questions and comments in the chat box. Okay. And with that, take it away, Jon.
All right, welcome everybody. Thanks for coming. My name's Jon. As Janelle said, Curator of Wildlife at the High Desert Museum, and you can probably see behind me, this is Walter. He's one of the golden eagles that lives here at the museum. So I really struggled with how to throw this presentation together because I understand that or most of the people who are participating are bird watchers. So there's probably not a ton that I can tell you all that you don't know about golden eagles. So what I did is I kind of threw together a PowerPoint that talks about what we do at the museum and some of the birds that we keep and some of the work that we've done specifically revolving around golden eagles. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen. We'll try to get through this PowerPoint in the next 40 minutes. And then when it's time for Q&A, I'll bring Walter up closer to the screen so everybody can get a close look at him. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So raptors at the High Desert Museum. We have quite a collection of animals at the museum. I'm going to minimize that. And all of the animals that we have at the museum are what we like to call ambassador animals. So an ambassador animal is just an animal, a live animal that lives at a museum or a zoo permanently, and it's used to educate others about their species. So for instance, all the raptors we have at the museum are held under permits for either the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act or the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. And our permits are specific to education. So the only way that we can have these animals is if we're using them to educate the public about conservation. We do have a large number of animals at the museum. Other than raptors, we have mammals, we have reptiles, we have fish, we have amphibians. Currently, we have 167 animals at the museum. So I'm sure there's a few people listening to this presentation who have been here before. You don't see that many when you visit the museum. You see a handful of animals that are on static exhibit. Most of our animals live behind the scenes and they're used for presentations like this one or live animal encounters. They go to libraries, they go to schools, and again, they're all used for education. This chart just kind of shows a breakdown of the species we have. You can see we're really heavy on fish. There's a lot of fish. So you come and see all the aquariums, reptiles, probably second. But then the birds, we have 27 raptors and 1 common raven. So raptors make up a good portion of the collection. Where do our birds come from? All the animals at the museum are non-releasable into the wild. The reason they're here is because something happened to them. For some reason, they can't live in the wild. They need a good place to be for the rest of their lives. Some of the birds that we have at the museum come from donation. Typically, these are falconry birds, and I do believe that the Bird Festival is going to be having a presentation from a local falconer. Falconry is the use of these birds for sport hunting, and falconers get their birds in a number of different ways. A bird that they trap from the wild might later be released back into the wild to do its thing, but a lot of their birds are bred in captivity, they're imprints. And because they were born and bred in captivity, they can't go back into the wild. And as those birds get old, or if they have behavioral or health issues that the falconer can't deal with, sometimes those folks will reach out to us to see if we can take them, and we'll provide a home for those birds and use them for education. Most of our birds, though, come from wildlife rehabilitation. These are birds that are previously wild, they've sustained an injury, or something along those lines that prevents them from being able to survive. And so they're here because they literally cannot live in the wild any longer. Other animals at the museum, this is especially true for our reptiles, they come from confiscation. People don't always realize that you're not allowed to have a wild animal as a pet. Again, all the animals that we have are held under closely managed permits. And I do have one bird in the collection that is a confiscation, and that's Walter, the golden eagle behind me. He was being kept illegally by somebody, and he came here after being taken away from them. Our animals are a lot more than just ambassadors. I have 4 full-time staff, well-trained, well-paid staff that work 7 days a week, 365 days a year, taking care of these animals. They get really extensive care, training, top-notch diet. We spend around $30,000 a year buying food for our critters. And we use operant conditioning, which means basically that we reward the birds and all of the animals for participating in the programs, usually with food. But the point is that they get to choose whether or not they want to participate, and that gives them a lot of choice and control. And that's considered these days in the zoo world to be kind of the highest metric of welfare. In addition to doing this education, we try to get all of our animals to participate in science. And so all of our animals, or many of our animals rather, one way or another, have participated in different kinds of scientific research. And I'm going to talk a little bit today about some of the research we've done with golden eagles here at the museum. So first of all, what exactly is a golden eagle? I'll just kind of give a brief kind of overview of what they are, because again, bird watchers, you all probably know as much as I do about these birds from seeing them in the wild. But basically, a golden eagle is I'll go back to this other slide, large raptor, largest raptor in North America. They tend to live in open areas. They are found really globally in the Northern Hemisphere, but in the United States, their stronghold really is the American West, the high desert, places like Harney County, where their populations are doing better than in other areas. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service downgraded their population estimates from, I think the last time I looked, it was 40,000, but they just changed it. Now they estimate there's 30,000 golden eagles in the U.S. 80% of them live in the West. So these guys, big, heavy birds, males weigh around 8 pounds, females can weigh 10, 11, maybe even more. They have light wing loadings. They're built to soar on thermals, cover a lot of ground, and they're migratory, so they move around a lot. They tend to nest on cliffs. So the high desert, again, really good habitat for golden eagles, lots of open sagebrush steppe habitat. They can locate prey from a long ways, but there's not a lot of trees, so they're nesting in these rimrock cliffs. They build these great big stick nests, and they're nesting right now. This particular nest in the picture here, this is at Fort Rock. So there's eagles nesting on the rock this year. They were there last year as well. And here's another picture of a stick nest. This is a stick nest that we actually entered and banded these chicks as part of a study that I'll talk briefly about here in a minute. Primary prey. Normally I would ask everybody what golden eagles eat, but nobody can answer the question, so I'll just say they eat a lot of rodents. So this is a Belding's ground squirrel. For those of you who have been to Harney County, Belding's ground squirrels, sometimes referred to as sage rats, very prolific in parts of Oregon. And golden eagles eat a lot of prey like that. Lagomorphs. So this is a black-tailed jackrabbit, probably the most important prey item to golden eagles in the high desert. Their ability to reproduce is really tied closely to jackrabbits. So jackrabbit populations will fluctuate. Some years jackrabbit populations are high, other years they're really, really low. And in years when there's a lot of jackrabbits on the landscape, eagles reproduce really well. In years when jackrabbit populations are low, they don't do quite as well. So they really closely tied to jackrabbits. The other thing that golden eagles eat that people don't really think of, it's not coyotes, it's carrion. And so this is a picture of a golden eagle feeding on a coyote that was most likely shot by somebody. So they, in addition to hunting, they don't pass up a free meal, especially in the wintertime. If there's something laying there that's dead, they're going to eat it. Again, golden eagles live, and everybody was typing in their favorite bird, and I love ospreys, I love kestrels, but I have to say that the golden eagle probably is my favorite raptor, and it's because of the places that you find them, and places like this, wide open expanses, sagebrush steppe, classic kind of high desert habitat. And if you can see that little black speck flying there in the cloud, that is a golden eagle. Again, these are some of my favorite places that I hang out, and pretty much all of these places are places where golden eagles live. This is up on Steens, right there in Harney County. What are the biggest threats to golden eagles? These days, it's probably increasing threats from urbanization, and just increasing use of the high desert. Historically, the high desert was relatively unpopulated by people. As we all know, that's starting to change these days. The High Desert Museum being here in Bend, there's more and more people coming into the region, and we're dealing a lot more with that. But other than habitat loss, urbanization, disturbance from humans, kind of the biggest threats to golden eagles kind of come from that natural history. Like I said, big birds that like to soar, they perch to hunt, they eat carrion. So lead poisoning is a major issue. The picture of the bird that just popped up is a bird that when I was out there in Crane doing some work, I saw this bird by the side of the road and I picked him up, got him to a wildlife rehabber, and he was actually a lead poisoned bird. He had picked up lead eating dead things out there along the road. Car strikes, another huge issue. I'll talk a little bit about the eagles that we have had at the museum over the years. I have 3 golden eagles at the museum right now, and not coincidentally, all 3 of them were hit by cars. It's probably the most common way that a golden eagle ends up in captivity. And again, that goes back to that scavenging behavior. Not only does it get them in trouble with things like secondary poisoning and lead poisoning, but oftentimes dead animals are found alongside the road. So when there's roadkill, they'll come down to eat it, and they'll end up getting hit. And that's probably one of the leading ways that they end up in captivity. Electrocution is the other one that gets them a lot. As you're birding through Harney County, no doubt you'll come across golden eagles sitting up on those power poles. And they have such a long wingspan that this bird sitting on the pole right now, you can see he could easily spread his wings, and if his wings touch both of those wires, he'll ground out and be electrocuted. So electrocution gets a lot of them as well. In the last couple of years, we've had 4 golden eagles at the museum. Walter's one that I'm going to share with you. Nicholas, if you ever come to the museum, Nicholas is our exhibit eagle. He's on static exhibit in the Bird of Prey Center here at the museum. Visitors can come and see him. We have Philip in the lower right there. Philip is an interesting bird because I said that all 3 of the eagles that I currently have were hit by cars. Philip was hit by a car and he was lead poisoned. So he kind of helps us tell that story of lead poisoning. The bird there in the upper left, I'll talk about that one a little bit. That's a rehab eagle. Didn't get a name, has a number 18-487. And that bird came from Blue Mountain Wildlife in Pendleton, Oregon. And using some of those training techniques that we have at the museum, I helped rehabbers at Blue Mountain Wildlife get that bird conditioned for release. Again, all of our eagles are ambassador eagles, other than that, rehab eagles. So they're used for public education. I love seeing eagles in the wild. I don't think anybody would argue that the wild is where they belong, but for these eagles that we have at the museum that can't survive in the wild, it's a wonderful way to connect people to these animals and get them to really understand and value these animals so that there is an impetus and a drive and kind of a passion for conservation. People, by virtue of seeing these animals up close, become more aware of the issues that they face and are more apt to try to protect them. Other than Nicholas, The eagle that we have on exhibit at the museum, all of the other eagles we've had are fully flighted. So they were hit by cars. They have problems with their shoulders and their joints that prevent them from being able to fly to the extent that a golden eagle would need to survive in the wild, but they can fly. And if you come to the museum in the summertime, we do a free flight show, and it is possible you'll see Philip or Walter, our flighted eagles, flying around when you come to our bird of prey show. That figures into some other work that we've done with golden eagles. So in addition to talking to the public and showing them our eagles, the museum has been pretty active in golden eagle conservation over the last 5 to 6 years. We've been involved in a number of projects looking at scavenging in golden eagles, that behavior where they're eating dead things that they find. Lead poisoning is another issue that we've looked at. We've done some eagle rehabilitation. I talked about that a little bit. And we've done a really cool project with Oregon State University, helping mitigate impacts of wind energy on eagles. I talked a little bit about those leading threats of golden eagles, which is kind of habitat loss, car strike, and electrocution. There's growing concern about wind energy. It's not real high on the list of things that are impacting eagles, but it is a concern because they tend to put wind energy in places where eagles live, and it does seem to impact them disproportionately to other birds. So some of the scavenger work that we've done here at the museum, we were involved for a number of years in a project that is actually still ongoing. It's resulted in a number of published papers, just kind of looking at eagle visitation rates to carrion. And what we would do is we would go and we had a permit to pick up road-killed deer. We'd take these deer and we would drop them off at random locations on the landscape, and we would use trail cameras to just monitor what kinds of animals showed up to eat them. Over the course of this study, we put out over 108 dead deer, and golden and bald eagles showed up to over 70% of those in Oregon and Washington. And on the Oregon cameras, which are the ones I was putting out, virtually all of them got eagles. Some of the results of that research showed that golden eagles, especially in the wintertime, disproportionately show up to deer carcasses. They're feeding heavily on carrion. And they have a really interesting relationship with common ravens, where they absolutely, we were able to show with a high degree of confidence that they key in on ravens and they use ravens to locate carrion. Takes a little while in this video for the eagles to show up, but they do show up. And once they do, they can open that carcass really effectively to get at the meat. Again, that's a conservation issue because dead deer down by the road, when they come down to eat these deer by the road, that puts them in harm's way. They can potentially get hit by cars. Again, that's the #1 way that they end up in captivity, is when they're hit by a car and not killed, but they become non-releasable into the wild because those injuries are too extensive for them to be able to survive anymore. The other is lead poisoning, which is something that we are more and more aware of. So when an animal has been shot with a lead bullet, that lead bullet can fragment into many tiny particles. And one of the really interesting things about raptors is they have phenomenal digestion. A lot of us have had the chance to look at an owl pellet before. You can take an owl pellet apart and you can kind of find the bones of the animal that they ate and see what they've been eating. Golden eagles have even better digestion than things like owls. The pH in their digestive tract is extremely low, as low as 0.8, I believe. So when they ingest the bones of an animal, they actually will completely digest that. So if you take apart the casting or the pellet from a golden eagle, you won't even find bones. What that means is that when they eat a small fragment of lead, that acid in their digestive tract, in addition to a couple of other factors related to their digestion, means that they can fully incorporate that lead into their bloodstream, and it can make them sick and it can kill them. And that's something that there's growing awareness about these days. And the hunting community increasingly is embracing non-lead ammunition, which is a really good thing for golden eagles. Whoops. I can send this link to Janelle, and maybe she can forward it to everybody that's involved in this presentation today, but their U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service just put out a really good ArcGIS story map on, it's called The Hidden Cost of a Free Meal, the sinister side of eating carrion for golden eagles. And it kind of highlights some of that work we did, not only with golden eagles, but also with other raptors, looking at lead poisoning. I spent a few years down there in Harney County running around trapping species like Swainson's hawks, red-tailed hawks, ferruginous hawks, and prairie falcons, looking at lead poisoning in those species as well. So lead poisoning is a huge issue for golden eagles, but it is an issue for other raptors additionally. So that's kind of one conservation project that we've been involved in. The other is this eagle rehab. This is 18-487, the eagle we got from Lynn Tompkins. And it's interesting, some of you may have heard of Joe Atkinson, who lives out there in Vail in Eastern Oregon. He does a lot of eagle rehab. And one of the issues that the rehabbers are seeing are these very young eagles that come into rehab. They're able to fly, but they've been separated from their parents probably shortly after fledging. I talked a minute ago about how eagles are a light wing loading, a high lofted bird, so they have to be able to soar. They have to be able to cover a lot of ground to find food, to migrate. And it turns out that that really is a learned behavior. It's not something that they can just do. So a fledgling golden eagle that's just leaving the nest has the benefit of being subsidized by mom and dad. Mom and dad are bringing food back to it while it's learning to fly and it's learning to hunt. And so kind of the thought that's going on in the wildlife rehab community is that these young birds that get separated from their parents can't do those things. And so in order to be able to successfully release them, they have to be given the benefit of learning how to fly. And what the rehabbers are trying to do is place these birds with falconers or with people like me here at the museum, where I can use some of the training techniques we use to work with our education eagles to teach these guys basically how to fly and help them build up those muscles and give them the time they need to learn to hunt before they just get released into the wild. Because if you take a bird that doesn't know how to fly very well, you turn it loose, it's going to starve to death. So using some of those techniques we use to train our birds, we worked with this bird in order to get it to come to a lure. And then I would go out every day for about 6 months east of Bend here, and we would just give her the opportunity to fly. Really simple training method. All she did, we would just let her fly around till she got tired. We'd bring her back to a lure. She'd get the rest of her food for the day, and then she'd have a safe place to sleep at night. So this is just kind of a video of her soaring in the desert out here east of Bend. And you can see it's a windy day. She's not really soaring as well as you would expect a wild golden eagle to be able to do. It really was a learned behavior. Over time, the bird got better at this, better and better at this. And she was able to do more and longer and more extensive flights. And so what this image is a picture of it. We had a GPS transmitter on her while she was flying. And you can kind of see the amount of flying that she was doing. And you can see at the bottom there, on this particular day, the GPS transmitter said that she was in the air flying for 1 hour and 3 minutes. And she covered the whole of this ridge. And you can see that one big long flight that she took out over this flat at the base of the ridge. So over the course of many months, she was able to build up her strength and be able to fly farther and farther. She also got to where she would go up really high. So we developed her strength to where she could soar like a wild eagle would be able to. And she'd go up a couple of times, 4,000 or 5,000 feet. I wouldn't even be able to see her anymore. But then she would come down to the lure. And that's a picture of her, video of her coming down to the lure. So using those methods we use to work with our birds here at the museum, we were able to get her flying. And that's just a 3D view of that other flight that I showed you. You can see I was down here on the valley floor. She went up way high. She was in the air for over an hour. Towards the end of this process, we got her to where she was able to actually catch rabbits. And then she was transferred back to Lynn Tompkins at Blue Mountain Wildlife and successfully released September before last at the same place she was found, which was outside of Baker in Eastern Oregon. One of the interesting things about the way this bird flew though, is you can notice you have this ridge here in the foreground, and she's flying kind of out away from the ridge, but she kind of keeps going back to it. And the reason for that is the way that golden eagles use those air currents in order to navigate the landscape. They're a big, heavy bird. It takes a lot of energy for them to fly under their own weight. So what they'll do is they'll go back to that ridge, and as the wind pushes up that ridge, they'll use the wind to kind of force them up so that they can gain altitude without exerting a ton of energy. So we were able to document the way this bird utilized those air currents, which was really interesting because we share this with our visitors now to help them understand why wind energy can be such a threat to golden eagles. Because the way this bird flew using those air currents, if you were going to put wind energy on this ridge, you'd put it in the exact place that this eagle was flying. And that's one of the reasons that wind energy so disproportionately impacts golden eagles. And it is a growing concern. So there's more and more wind energy going in the high desert. This is a picture of some of the wind farms that are going in for those of you that have been down I-84, the big wind farms that you can see up there around Umatilla. And there in Wasco County, those blue lines on the far left, that's a new one that's slated to be finished in 2023. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service actually recommended against that one because they thought it was going to have too heavy of an impact on golden eagles, but it was approved anyway, so that's going to go in. So that brings us to some work that we did with Oregon State University. Like I said, the eagles that we have at the museum, the 3 of them, 2 of them can actually fly. So back in 2019, we were contacted by the Oregon State University by Professor Roberto Albertani. And he had gotten a large grant from the Department of Energy to study ways to make wind energy safer for golden eagles. There was a number of competing researchers that got grants, and they had different ideas for kind of how to make wind energy safer for golden eagles, but he had a particular idea that involved putting cameras on the front of the windmill on the nose cone of those wind turbines so that the camera would record birds flying towards the wind turbine. And what he wanted to do is write a computer program that would allow the computer to tell whether or not the bird was an eagle. The ultimate idea was to be able to shut those off in time to avoid a blade strike, the eagle running into the blade. But before that would happen, they wanted to deploy an eagle deterrent. So what they wanted to do is have the program recognize a bird flying in from a distance, determine whether or not it was a golden eagle. And if it was a golden eagle or a bald eagle, they would deploy deterrent. And you had those noodle dancing guys that you see at the used car lots. He had those at the base of the windmill. So those things would come up and try to scare the eagle away from the wind farm. But if that didn't work, they would try to slow it down and shut it before there was a strike. Additionally, he put little blade vibration nodes on those blades so that if there was a strike, that data will be recorded. Because one of the problems with wind energy is that there's not really good data on how many birds are actually killed. They do a lot of surveys under those blades looking for carcasses and things, but a lot of the carcasses are removed by scavengers and things like that, and some of that data is questionable. That's just a picture of the camera that he used, and on the left is Walter the golden eagle. So where the museum comes in, like I said, we fly our birds, they can fly extensively. And so what ended up happening is Roberto Albertani and Oregon State University came down. They spent probably a week at the museum just recording the birds flying around. And what they used that information for, the footage, was to write a computer algorithm that allowed the camera to determine whether or not a bird was in fact a golden eagle. So the eagles would just fly repeatedly to and from the camera, because the idea was that in order for one of those blade turbines to slow down and turn off in time, they would have to detect the eagle from more than 1,000 feet away. So like I said, we did this work over 3 or 4 days. Walter, who you're going to meet here in a minute, just kind of flew back and forth, and they used that information to write the computer algorithm. And this is just kind of what it looked like. Doesn't look like much. He just zooms over the camera. They have a 360-degree camera. And the latest update to that program is that he's been able to document a lot of success. Like I said, there's a couple of other projects, competing projects, that are doing really well and been in the news. But it is promising, and the museum was proud to be able to support that research and the conservation of golden eagles. And I actually made it through my whole presentation in about a half an hour. So Janelle, if you want to take any questions, I'll bring Walter up and we can talk about him a little bit specifically.
Awesome. Yeah, let's take some questions from the chat box. So if you have something that you would like to ask Jon about the life history of golden eagles, maybe about other birds. There was a question from early on about ferruginous hawks. So Allie is curious about the population levels of ferruginous hawks in Eastern or Central Oregon.
Yeah, so I don't know a ton about the current status of their populations. I know that they're an Oregon conservation strategy species, and they are a species of concern. I haven't been terribly involved in ferruginous hawk research, but I have helped a little bit with it. So I do know that there are people studying those populations here in Central Oregon, especially, and their populations do overall seem to be going down. However, you do still see them out where you guys are at, and we're lucky here around the High Desert Museum. The primary place that I take folks on our field trips to look at ferruginous hawks is down by Fort Rock and Silver Lake, and they're still very abundant down there.
Awesome. Okay, so Mr. Weevil's 4th grade class is curious, what temperatures do eagles prefer?
That's a really good question. So all the time when people come to the museum and they see Nicholas, our exhibit eagle, out on exhibit in the wintertime, they're worried that he's cold. Birds, the cold doesn't really bother them. They are covered with feathers. They're really well insulated. All of the eagles really, really like the cold. The colder, the better, actually, I would say. Eagles do migrate a lot, and we have more eagles in the high desert in the wintertime than we do in the summertime. And a lot of those birds are coming from Alaska and Canada. And it's not because it's cold up there, it's just because there's not a lot of food. So they come down in the wintertime to find food, but they really like the cold. The hot, they don't like as much. And so on a really, really hot day, eagles will be roosting probably, or they'll be way up in the sky soaring to get out of that heat.
Wow, that's great. Okay, so is there documented progress in reducing lead toxicity?
Documented process or progress, I'm not entirely sure. So some of that work that we did was used just to measure visitation rates to carrion in an attempt to quantify potentially how much exposure was going on. Also, ways to mitigate whether or not birds are getting carrion. The best way to mitigate whether or not they're getting lead, pardon me. The best way to mitigate that, obviously, is to use non-lead ammunition. But what we found from some of that work is for a while, there was talk of just being able to cover a carcass with vegetation and keep eagles from getting it, and that doesn't work. You have to bury it completely, or you have to use non-lead ammunition. I don't know that fewer birds are being lead poisoned these days, but it is very, very promising. The hunting community, hunters are excellent conservationists. Most of them are very in tune with conserving wildlife, and more they're embracing copper ammunition. It's very effective. It's becoming more available, and tons of hunters are using it with great success. So that's very, very promising.
Great, thank you. We have a question about the presence of golden eagles on the coast. Is it common to see them out there?
So golden eagles, really, you can see them anywhere in Oregon, but they are much more common in the high desert. They like I said, they're preying really on rodents and jackrabbits, which are super abundant. When you go to the coast, you're much more likely to see bald eagles.
Yeah. Okay. Allie asks, have you noticed a discoloration in the iris of lead-poisoned eagles? All that she has rescued have had flecking in their iris when the lead was an issue.
So I personally haven't. I do know, so I spent all the time that I spent kind of catching and taking blood samples of birds that were exposed to lead. Those birds all had relatively low levels of exposure. So sublethal impacts is what we were looking at. So I haven't had a lot of exposure to birds that were like lethally exposed to lead, but that's an interesting question. And that's definitely something that the rehab community might look at as a way to diagnose, I suppose.
Yeah. Okay, what about the treatment for lead poisoning?
So the treatment for lead poisoning tends to be chelation. So they'll inject a synthetic material into the bird, which binds to that lead and allows it to be excreted. And I'm not a rehabber, so I'm not really up to speed on how that all works. But you know, there are methods to try to save the birds, but unfortunately, a lot of them do die. It's very, very, very bad.
Yeah. Okay, and where do they, I'm gonna presume golden eagles, migrate to and from? What is their distribution and range?
So they're found all over the world in the Northern Hemisphere. So I don't really know much about European and Asian golden eagles, but in the United States and North America, they tend to be found more in the West, up through Alaska and Canada. I'm losing my voice, I apologize.
That's okay, thank you for.
In the wintertime, those populations will shift south, and actually they'll shift east a little bit. So you'll see more golden eagles in the northeastern United States in the wintertime. But just to give you an example, when I was doing some field work, I would occasionally get called to go find GPS transmitters that had been on birds that were dead. So they'd be tracking a bird and all of a sudden the transmitter would quit working. And since I was way out in the high desert, they would call me and say, hey, can you go try to find this and see what's going on? And I picked one up out there near Harney County, out at Wagon Tire. And the bird that it came off of actually was a nesting bird in Denali in Alaska. But it was down here for the winter and something happened to it. It was dead. All I found was the GPS tracker.
Wow. Great. Okay, how long does a golden eagle live on average?
On average, so we like to talk about median life expectancy for captive birds, and usually it's around 16 years is the median. You can expect a captive bird reasonably to live into its 30s, kind of on the high end. And there's reports out there of birds in captivity living into their 40s, 50s. And in Europe, there's at least one I know of that allegedly lived to be 60 years old. So they're relatively long-lived species. And Walter, for example, we don't really know how old Walter is because he came into captivity as an adult eagle, but I think he's probably about 17 or 18 now. He'll probably be at the museum for another 15 years at least.
Wow. Okay, Michael asks, why were only eagles the focus of Albertoni's project?
That's a good question. Why were eagles the only focus of the project? So there's a long answer to that question and there's a short answer. I'm going to give you the short answer. It's because of the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act. They receive special protections under an act of Congress. And it was very controversial during the Obama administration where they granted a 30-year take permit to wind energy producers, basically to be able to kill a certain number of golden eagles. But what they were actually doing was trying to encourage those folks to report the eagles that were actually being killed so that they could then mitigate. And that's how those funds became available for Albertoni to do that research. It was through the Department of Energy trying to help wind energy mitigate for losses to golden eagles by finding solutions. But it was because of the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, how do both you and the eagle get past any fear and aggression towards each other? I imagine this would be kind of an intake experience when an eagle is first coming into care.
So I give them lots of good treats, just like I'm doing right now. Walter in particular is a challenging bird. A lot of the birds we have at the museum they're hard cases, and that's why we get them. We're known for taking birds that other places have not been successful with and being able to turn them around. And he is a pretty aggressive eagle. He likes me well enough. I'm not aggressive towards him ever. I'm also not very afraid of him, but he's put me in the hospital one time. So he is, I mean, he's got, I'll try to show you his feet. His feet are no joke. But basically, it's all positive reinforcement. When he does things that I want him to do, like right now, he's being calm in front of the camera, I reward him. And when he's doing things I don't want him to do, we don't reward it. It's pretty simple. It's more complicated than that in practice, but we focus on nice, positive interactions.
That's great. We've got some excellent questions here, a few students. So Annabelle asks, what do you use to bring the eagles back to you instead of flying away with the birds that aren't ready to be released on their own?
So with that rehab eagle that I was working with, what we did is we lure trained her, and we just had a leather lure. And we did what we call lure targeting. So I would take a piece of food and I would tie it to that lure, and I would just let her eat off of that lure. And after doing that for a while, she associated that lure with food. And I got to the point where I didn't have to have food on the lure anymore. I could throw it out, she would come down and grab it, and then she would come back to me in order to get that reward. So we kind of shaped that behavior of coming back to me for food. And then once you have done that, as long as you have a good positive relationship with the bird, they will almost always come back to you.
Wow, that's great. Okay, does Walter live with you?
No, Walter lives at the museum. All 28 of the birds live at the museum. I've had birds at my house before. I don't recommend it.
Okay, and how long is his wingspan?
His wingspan, so he's a male golden eagle. Today he weighed 8 pounds, 6 ounces, which is pretty heavy for him. Usually he's closer to 8 pounds. Females will be a lot bigger. Walter's wingspan's probably about 6.5 feet. I was gonna see if he would open them for you. You wouldn't be able to see the tip to tip anyway. But a big female can be, 8-foot wingspan.
Wow, that's so impressive. Okay. How much weight can a golden eagle carry in its claws? That's a question from Liam.
I love that question. So I just, oh, he's gonna get on the table, I guess. Sorry about that. Decided there was something over there that he wanted to get. So I love that question. I told you guys he weighs about 8 pounds today. General rule of thumb, raptors can't pick up and fly away with things that weigh much more than they do. And that's why jackrabbits are a really good prey item for golden eagles. Jackrabbits weigh, 4 or 5 pounds. They can kill it pretty easily and safely, and they can potentially fly away with it, take it to the nest. I've had people swear to me up and down they've seen eagles flying away with full-grown pronghorn antelope. They can't do that. Right. They can't lift up anything that weighs very much more than he does.
Excellent. Okay. How long has the eagle species lived? So I think we kind of touched on that with birds in captivity living quite a long time. You said golden eagles experience reduced reproduction when the jackrabbit populations are down. Do their populations also fall? And what is the jackrabbit cycle, and why do their populations fluctuate?
So that's a good question. Jackrabbit population cycles usually about 10 years, and eagles will do really well in like I said, years when there's lots of jackrabbits. Eagles reproduce slowly compared to other raptors. Most years they'll only have one, lay a couple of eggs. They'll have 1, maybe 2 chicks, and not many of those chicks actually survive. So in years when there's not a lot of jackrabbits, golden eagles might not even try to reproduce. But yeah, you can see those populations following behind the jackrabbit fluctuations. And that's something that's still being studied currently. There wasn't a lot of good data on it, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is currently looking at things like that and all of the things that impact golden eagle abundance and how their populations fluctuate. Things that impact that jackrabbit population, rabbit populations in general fluctuate according to things like climate and disease. And right now in Oregon, we have a really bad disease going through our rabbits, this viral hemorrhagic disease, which is probably going to take that black-tailed jackrabbit population down, and no doubt the golden eagles will have a few years of low productivity because of that.
Excellent. So that covers, I believe, every question in the chat box. Janice did ask, can we see Walter again? And I wonder if that refers to visiting at the museum.
Yeah, I hope everybody's been able to see him in the screen. Yeah, Walter, you can see him at the museum. Him and Philip both fly in our Raptors of the Desert Sky program that runs from Memorial Day through Labor Day. They don't fly every day, but they fly many, many days. And Nicholas, our other golden eagle, is on exhibit here all the time. In addition to that, during the wintertime, we do bird of prey talks at least once, if not twice a day, and the eagles come out frequently for those.
Great. What age do golden eagles begin to reproduce?
So a lot of raptors actually will reproduce when they're about, say, 3 years old. Golden and bald eagles, it takes them 5 years to reach maturity, and they can go through a bunch of plumage changes in those first 5 years that you can identify an immature bird. And it's a little more subtle in golden eagles than it is in bald eagles. Bald eagles, it's pretty dramatic though. They don't get that white head and white tail until they're 5 years old. And then after that, they're sexually mature. I mentioned earlier, we don't really know how old Walter is. He came into captivity as an adult, so he already had his adult plumage. So we know he was older than 5 when we got him, but we don't know how old he is. We don't know how many years he was in the wild before he came here.
Great. And for the next question, I'm actually going to stop sharing my screen so that you will be full screen when you answer. But Sharon asks, do golden eagles, oh no, the question before I wanted to ask first. Do all golden eagles have orangish eyes around the pupil? So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and put you in speaker view. And hopefully everyone can see you nice and big now.
Is it working?
It's working for me. If anyone else on the call is seeing everyone as very small, I would suggest you go to the viewing option, which may be at the top or bottom of your screen, and select speaker view rather than gallery view. And that will put Jon front and center.
So eye color in golden eagles, it varies a little bit. And you can see that Walter has these very yellow eyes. My other eagles have orange eyes. So there's some variation for sure.
Great. Okay. Do golden eagles recognize spoken or body language?
Body language. He doesn't understand a word I'm saying. Yeah, he reacts to my body language and lots of good food.
Okay. And Steve, touching again on migration, about golden eagles migrating. Yes, they do.
They absolutely do, but not all golden eagles do. So there's eagles here in the high desert that are here year round on their territories, but we have those northern birds that will come in the wintertime.
Fantastic. Okay. Well, as Jon mentioned, there are several other birds of prey at the museum, and I wonder if anyone has any questions they want to ask before we start to wrap up about golden eagle still, or maybe any other birds you're curious about.
And so for those of you who haven't been to our summer programs, our Raptors of the Desert Sky program, we'll take about 200 people a day out into a clearing on the north end of the property, and you'll get to see at least 5 species fly. We have Harris's hawks, Oplomato falcon, peregrine falcon, great horned owl, barn owl, turkey vultures, golden eagles, and I'm sure I'm forgetting some others, but different birds, many different days, and they fly right over your head.
Awesome. Yeah, so Janice just asked, did you say that you have other birds of prey in your collection at the museum?
Yeah, I should have made a list of how many species, but 27 birds, quite a few different species.
Wow. And Steve says, I have heard them bark, almost like an elk does. Have you?
Yeah, so everybody, when we think of birds, everybody thinks that this is the sound that they make. In fact, all of the birds at the museum make all different kinds of sounds. And when you work with them in captivity, you get the pleasure of being able to hear that. And I've heard them bark and chirp and scream, and they make all kinds of noises. Walter in particular, he's quiet right now, but when I put him back in his enclosure, when I go to pick him up in the morning, he's very chatty.
Great. This is one of my favorite questions. How do you distinguish between golden eagles and immature bald eagles?
That's a great question. So immature bald eagles look very much like golden eagles, but they'll tend to be very mottled. They'll have a lot of brown or lighter colors, white on the body mixed in with the brown. Golden eagles, when they're immature especially, tend to be just chocolate brown, and you'll see a white at the base of the tail, occasionally a little bit of white underneath the wings. Additionally, they fly a little bit different, and after you've been watching them for a long time, you can pick up on that. But the bald eagle too just has that very massive beak, and when you get a good look at that beak, it's really hard to mistake them if you know the difference between a bald eagle beak and a golden eagle beak.
Great. Okay, and do you at the museum have any hybrids like spart owls?
Nope, no hybrids. I think there is a place in the valley that has a spart owl, but we have no hybrids.
Awesome. Great. Well, Walter has just been a dream. Thank you so much for bringing him out today.
Of course.
Okay. I think unless anyone has one last question, I am just going to share my screen again. I want to thank Jon and Walter, and I want to tell everyone very briefly about what's coming up over the weekend with the rest of the Bird Festival. So thank you so much, Jon and Walter. This has just been absolutely wonderful. So thank you everyone who came today for this presentation. Tonight, if you're really into birds of prey, you might want to attend the presentation on the great gray owl from Paul Bannock, who recently wrote a book with the same title. And tomorrow we've got a full lineup all day long with our keynote speaker, Ken Kaufman, giving a presentation on the Centers of Survival, bird migration, and the National Wildlife Refuges. And then, as Jon mentioned, we do have a presentation on Sunday about falconry from Pat Brewster, who lives here in Harney County, and she is a master falconer. So lots of really great stuff to catch up on. You can find it all at migratorybirdfestival.com or at the Migratory Bird Festival Facebook page. But that's not all. We also have an interactive choose your own adventure story map up on the website where you are invited to learn all about Harney County history, wildlife, and the landscape through this story called Prairie Songs for a Feathered Heart, where you are a detective searching for a missing person and their family's treasure. So I hope that you get a chance to explore that as well. And lastly, I just want to remind everyone the value of the partnership here in Harney County that brings the Migratory Bird Festival to life every year, and your participation really supports this effort so that we can keep it going. Thank you to all our partners, and thank you, all of our participants, so much. Really appreciate it. And Jon and Walter, you guys were great. Thank you for being here today.